Imagine a city where the streets were paved and lit by oil lamps while most of the world was still struggling through the mud of the Dark Ages. This was Córdoba, in the year 1126. It was a place where libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and where the air felt thick with the exchange of ideas between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In this cradle of civilization, a boy named Ibn Rushd, known to history as Averroes, was born into a family of elite judges. He was a child of the law, a student of the divine, and eventually, the man who would try to bridge the gap between human reason and religious faith. His story is not just a biography of a philosopher, it is a drama about what happens when a society decides that thinking has become too dangerous. Averroes did not start his life as a rebel. In fact, he was the ultimate insider. His grandfather had been the chief judge of Córdoba, and his father held the same prestigious title. From a young age, he mastered the complexities of Islamic jurisprudence and theology. But for Averroes, the study of the law was only the beginning. He looked at the stars and studied astronomy. He looked at the human body and studied medicine. And eventually, he looked at the ancient texts of Greece and found his true calling in philosophy. He believed that the universe operated on logical principles, and that these principles were put there by a creator who wanted us to understand them. To Averroes, using your mind was not an act of defiance against God. It was the highest form of worship. His life took a decisive turn when he was introduced to the works of Aristotle. At the time, Aristotle was a distant memory in the West, but his ideas had been preserved and debated in the Islamic world. However, those ideas had become clouded by centuries of mystical interpretations and confusing additions. Averroes wanted to strip all of that away. He wanted to find the pure, cold logic of the original thinker. He became so synonymous with this mission that for centuries afterward, he was simply referred to as the commentator. He argued that there were different paths to the same truth. For the masses, there was the path of stories and symbols found in religion. For the scholars, there was the path of logical demonstration. Crucially, he insisted that these two paths could never truly contradict each other, because truth cannot contradict truth. For a while, the world seemed to agree with him. He rose to become a judge himself, and eventually served as the personal physician to the caliph. Under the protection of enlightened rulers, he spent his nights writing the commentaries that would eventually change the course of human history. He lived in a golden age where a man could be a devout believer and a rigorous scientist at the same time. But golden ages are often more fragile than they appear. Beneath the surface of Córdoba's brilliance, the political ground was shifting. The empire was under pressure from Christian kingdoms to the north, and internal rebellions from within. In times of fear, societies often retreat into fundamentalism. The nuance of philosophy became a luxury the ruling class felt they could no longer afford. Theologians began to whisper that Averroes and his logic were undermining the faith of the people. They argued that by saying the universe followed laws, he was limiting the power of God. They painted the philosopher as an arrogant elitist who thought his mind was superior to the revelation of the prophets. The turning point was sudden and brutal. A new ruler, seeking to consolidate his power and win the favor of the religious establishment, decided that philosophy was a convenient scapegoat. In the year 1195, Averroes was publicly disgraced. His ideas were condemned, and a decree was issued for his books to be burned. Imagine the scene in the public square, the smell of parchment and ink turning to ash, as the life's work of one of the world's greatest minds was fed to the flames. He was stripped of his titles and exiled to a small, dusty town called Lucena. Exile for a man like Averroes was a living death. He was cut off from his students, his libraries, and the intellectual pulse of the city he loved. He went from being the most respected mind in the empire to a ghost, a man whose name people were afraid to speak. The culture that had nurtured him for 70 years had decided it no longer had a place for him. He was eventually allowed to return to Morocco shortly before his death in 1198, but the damage was done. When he died, his funeral was a quiet affair. There is a famous story that when his body was being transported back to Córdoba, his coffin was placed on one side of a donkey and his books were placed on the other to balance the weight. It was a final, silent image of a life spent trying to balance the heavy demands of the world and the weight of ideas. But this is where the story takes a strange and ironic turn. As the Islamic world began to turn away from the rationalism of Averroes, his ideas were smuggled across the borders into Europe. His commentaries were translated into Latin and Hebrew, and they hit the universities of Paris and Padua like a lightning bolt. Medieval scholars who had been stuck in a cycle of dogma suddenly had a toolkit for logic. They didn't always agree with him. In fact, many of them tried to refute him, but they couldn't ignore him. He became the bridge that allowed the Renaissance to happen. The very ideas that were burned in Cordoba became the foundation for the scientific revolution in the West. It is a bitter irony that Averroes became a hero in lands he never visited and a stranger in the land where he was born. For centuries, his name was a footnote in the East while it was a cornerstone in the West. His life serves as a quiet warning about the cost of intellectual fear. When a society decides that it is afraid of questions, it doesn't just silence a philosopher, it surrenders its own future. Averroes didn't want to start a revolution or destroy a faith. He simply wanted us to understand that our ability to think is the greatest gift we have been given. Today, we often think of the conflict between reason and authority as a modern problem, but Averroes was fighting that battle 900 years ago. He showed us that ideas are like seeds. You can burn the field and you can exile the farmer, but if the wind is right, those seeds will find a way to bloom somewhere else. His legacy is a testament to the fact that while a man can be silenced, a truth, once spoken, belongs to the world. What do you think about the story of Averroes? Do you think we are still repeating the same mistakes today by choosing comfort over difficult questions? It is a heavy thought to leave you with, but I am interested to see what you have to say in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.